Chapter 41 The Overlook. At Coeur d'Alene, we went straight into the hospital. Gramps had tried to wake Gram when he saw the lake. Gooseberry? Gramps said. She slumped sideways on the seat. Gooseberry? The doctor said Gram had had a stroke. Gramps insisted on being with her while she underwent tests, though an intern had tried to dissuade him. She's unconscious, the intern said. She won't know whether you're here or not. Sonny, I've been here by her side for 51 years, except for 3 days when she left me for the Eggman. I'm holding on to her hand, see? If you want me to let go, you'll have to chop my hand off. They let him stay with her. While I was waiting in the lobby, a man came in with an old beagle. The receptionist told him he would have to leave the dog outside. By herself? The man said. I said, I'll watch her. I had a dog just like her once. I took the old beagle outside, and when I sat down on the grass, the beagle put her head in my lap and murmured in that special way dogs have. Gramps calls it a dog's purr. I wondered if Gramps' snake bite had anything to do with her stroke, and if Gramps felt guilty for whizzing off the highway and stopping at that river. If we hadn't gone to that river, Gram would never have been bitten by that snake. And then I started thinking about my mother's stillborn baby, and maybe if I hadn't climbed that tree, and if my mother hadn't carried me, maybe the baby would have lived, and my mother never would have gone away, and everything would still be as it used to be. But as I sat there thinking these things, it occurred to me that a person couldn't stay all locked up in the house, like Phoebe and her mother had tried to do at first. A person had to go out and do things and see things, and I wondered, for the first time, if this had something to do with Gram and Gramps taking me on this trip. The beagle in my lap was just like our Moody Blue. I rubbed her head and prayed for Gram. I thought about Moody Blue's litter of puppies. For the first week, Moody Blue wouldn't let anyone come anywhere near those puppies. She licked them clean and nuzzled them. They squealed and pawed their way up to her with their eyes still sealed. Gradually, Moody Blue let us touch the puppies, but she kept her sharp eyes on us, and if we tried to take a puppy out of her sight, she growled. Within a few weeks, the puppies were stumbling away from her, and Moody Blue spent her days herding them back. But when they were about 6 weeks old, Moody Blue started ignoring them. She snapped at them and pushed them away. I told my mother that Moody Blue was being terrible. She hates her puppies. It's not terrible, my mother said. It's normal. She's weaning them from her. Does she have to do that? Why can't they stay with her? It isn't good for her or for them. They have to become independent. What if something happened to Moody Blue? They wouldn't know how to survive without her. While I prayed for Gram outside the hospital, I wondered if my mother's trip to Idaho was like Moody Blue's behavior. Maybe part of it was for my mother and part of it was for me. When the beagle's owner returned, I went back inside. It was after midnight when a nurse told me I could see Gram. She was lying still and gray on the bed. A little dribble was coming out of one side of her mouth. Gramps was leaning over her, whispering in her ear. A nurse said, I don't think she can hear you. Of course she can hear me, Gramps said. She'll always be able to hear me. Gram's eyes were closed. Wires were attached to her chest and to a monitor, and a tube was taped to her hand. I wanted to hold her and wake her up. Gramps said, We're going to be here a while, Chickabiddy. He reached in his pockets and pulled out his car keys. Here, in case you need anything from the car. He handed me a crumpled wad of money. In case you need it. I don't want to leave Gram, I said. Heck, he said. She doesn't want you sitting around this old hospital. You just whisper in her ear if you want to tell her anything, and then you go do what you have to do. We're not going anywhere. Your grandmother and I. We'll be right here. He winked at me. You be careful, Chickabiddy. I leaned over and whispered in Gram's ear, and then I left. In the car, I studied the map, leaned back in the seat, and closed my eyes. Gramps knew what I was going to do. The key was cold in my hand. I studied the map again. One curvy road ran direct from Coeur d'Alene to Lewiston. I started the car, backed it up, drove around the parking lot, stopped, and turned off the engine. I counted the money in my pocket and looked at the map once more. In the course of a lifetime, there were some things that mattered. Although I was terrified when I drove out of the parking lot, Once I was on the highway, I felt better. I drove slowly, and I knew how to do it. I prayed to every passing tree, and there were a thumping lot of trees along the way. It was a narrow, winding road without traffic. It took me 4 hours to drive the 100 miles from Coeur d'Alene to the top of Lewiston Hill, which to me was much more of a mountain than a hill. I pulled into the overlook at the top. In the valley far below was Lewiston, with the Snake River winding through it. Between me and Lewiston was the treacherous road with its hairpin turns that twisted back and forth down the mountain. I peered over the rail, looking for the bus that I knew was still somewhere down there on the side of the mountain, but I couldn't see it. I can do this, I said to myself, over and over. I can do this. I eased the car back onto the road. At the first curve, my heart started thumping. My palms were sweating and slippery on the wheel. I crept along with my foot on the brake, but the road doubled back so sharply and plunged so steeply that even with my foot on the brake, the car was going faster than I wanted it to. When I came out of the curve, I was in the outside lane, the one nearest to the side of the cliff. It was a sharp drop down with only a thin cable strung between occasional posts to mark the edge of the road. Back and forth across the hill, the road snaked for a half-mile. I was on the inside against the hill and felt safer. And then I came to one of those awful curves. And for the next half-mile I was on the outside, and the dark slide of the hillside stretched down, down, down. Back and forth I went, half a mile safe, a curve, a half a mile edging the side of the cliff. Halfway down was another overlook, a thin extra lane marked off less as an opportunity to gaze at the scenery. I thought then to allow drivers a chance to stop and gather their wits. I wondered how many people had abandoned their cars at this point and walked the remaining miles down. As I stood looking over the side, another car pulled onto the overlook. A man got out and stood near me, smoking a cigarette. "Where are the others?" he asked. "What others?" "Who's ever with you? Who's ever driving?" "Oh," I said, "around." "Taking a pee, eh?" he said, referring, I gathered, to whoever was supposedly with me. "A hell of a road to be driving at night, isn't it? I do it every night. I work up in Pullman and live down there." He pointed to the lights of Lewiston and the Black River. "You been here before?" he said. "No." "See that?" He pointed to a spot somewhere below. I peered into the darkness. Then I saw the severed treetops and the rough path cut through the brush. At the end of this path I could see something shiny and metallic reflecting the moonlight. It was the one thing I had been looking for. "A bus went off the road here a year or more ago," he said. "Skidded right there coming out of the last turn, and went sliding into this here overlook and on through the railing, and rolled over and over into those trees. A hell of a thing. When I came home that night, rescuers were still hacking their way through the brush to get to it. Only one person survived, you know." I knew. Chapter 42. The Bus and the Willow. When the man drove off, I crawled beneath the railing and made my own way down the hill toward the bus. In the east, the sky was smoky gray, and I was glad for the approaching dawn. In the year and a half since the trail was hacked out, the brush had begun to grow back. Wet with dew, straggly branches slapped and scratched at my legs, and hid uneven ground so that several times I tripped, tumbling and sliding downward. The bus lay on its side like an old sick horse, its broken headlights staring out mournfully into the surrounding trees. Most of the huge rubber tires were punctured and grotesquely twisted on their axles. I climbed up onto the bus's side, hoping to make my way down to an open window, but there were 2 enormous gashes torn into the side, and the jagged metal was peeled back like a sardine tin. Through a smashed window behind the driver's seat, I saw a jumbled mess of twisted seats and chunks of foam rubber. Everything was dusted over the fuzzy green mold. I had imagined that I would drop through a window and walk down the aisle, but there was no space inside to move. I had wanted to scour every inch of the bus, looking for something, anything, that might be familiar. By now the sky was pale pink, and it was easier to find the uphill trail, but harder going as it was a steep incline. By the time I reached the top, I was muddy and scratched from head to toe. It wasn't until I had crawled beneath the railing that I noticed the car parked behind Gramps' old Chevrolet. It was the sheriff. He was talking on his radio when he saw me, and he motioned for his deputy to get out. The deputy said, "We were just about to come down there after you. We saw you up on top of the bus. You kids ought to know better. What are you doing down there at this time of day, anyway?" Before I could answer, the sheriff climbed out of his car. He settled his hat on his head and shifted his holster. "Where are the others?" he said. "There aren't any others," I said. "Who brought you up here?" "I brought myself." "Whose car is this?" "My grandfather's." "And where is he?" The sheriff glanced to left and right, as if Gramps might be hiding in the bushes. "He's in Coeur d'Alene," the sheriff said. "Pardon?" So I told him about Gram and about how Gramps had to stay with her and about how I had driven from Coeur d'Alene very carefully. The sheriff said, "Now let me get this straight," and he repeated everything I said, ending with, "And you're telling me that you drove down from Coeur d'Alene to this spot on this hill all by yourself?" "Very carefully," I said. "My Gramps taught me how to drive, and he taught me to drive very carefully." The sheriff said to the deputy, I'm afraid to ask this young lady exactly how old she is. Why don't you ask her?" The deputy said, "How old are you?" I told him. The sheriff gave me a stern look and said, "I don't suppose you would mind telling me exactly what was so all-fired important that you couldn't wait for someone with a legitimate driver's license to bring you to the fair city of Lewiston?" And so I told him all the rest. When I had finished, he returned to his car and talked into his radio some more. Then he told me to get in his car, and he told the deputy to follow in Gramps' car. I thought the sheriff was probably going to put me in jail, and it wasn't the thought of jail that bothered me so much. It was knowing that I was this close and might not be able to do what I had come to do, and it was knowing that I needed to get back to Gram. He did not take me to jail, however. He drove across the bridge into Lewiston and on through the city and up a hill. He drove into Longwood, stopped at the caretaker's house, and went inside. Behind us was the deputy and Gramps' car. The caretaker came out and pointed off to the right, and the sheriff got back in the car and drove off in that direction. It was a pleasant place. The Snake River curved behind this section, and tall, full-leaved trees grew here and there across the lawn. The sheriff parked the car and led me up a path toward the river, and there, on a little hill overlooking the river and the valley, was my mother's grave. On the tombstone beneath her name and the dates of her birth and death was an engraving of a maple tree. And it was only then, when I saw the stone and her name, Jehason Sugar Pickford Hiddle, and the engraving of the tree, that I knew by myself and for myself that she was not coming back. I asked if I could sit there for a little while because I wanted to memorize the place. I wanted to memorize the grass and the trees and the smells and the sounds. In the midst of the still morning, with only the sound of the river gurgling by, I heard a bird. It was singing a bird song, a true sweet bird song. I looked all around and then up into the willow that leaned toward the river. The bird song came from the top of the willow, and I did not want to look too closely because I wanted it to be the tree that was singing. I kissed the willow. "Happy birthday," I said. In the sheriff's car, I said, "She isn't actually gone at all. She's singing in the trees." "Whatever you say, Miss Salamanca Hiddle. You can take me to jail now." Chapter 43, Our Gooseberry. Instead of taking me to jail, the sheriff drove me to Coeur d'Alene with the deputy following us in Gramps' car. The sheriff gave me a lengthy and severe lecture about driving without a license, and he made me promise that I would not drive again until I was 16. "Not even on Gramps' farm?" I said. He looked straight ahead at the road. "I suppose people are going to do whatever they want to on their own farms," he said, "as long as they've a lot of room to maneuver, and as long as they are not endangering the lives of any other persons or animals. But I'm not saying you ought to. I'm not giving you permission or anything." I asked him to tell me about the bus accident. When I asked him if he had been there that night, and if he had seen anyone brought out of the bus, he said, "You don't want to know all that. A person shouldn't have to think about those things." "Did you see my mother?" "I saw a lot of people, Samantha. And maybe I saw your mother, and maybe I didn't, but I'm sorry to say that if I did see her, I didn't know it. I remember your father coming into the station. I do remember that. But I wasn't with him when... I wasn't there when... Did you see Mrs. Cadaver? I said. How do you know about Mrs. Cadaver? He said. Of course I saw Mrs. Cadaver. Everyone saw Mrs. Cadaver. 9 hours after the bus rolled over, as all those stretchers were being carried up the hill and everyone despairing, there was her hand coming up out of the window, and everyone was shouting because there was a moving hand. He glanced at me. I wish it had been your mother's hand. Mrs. Cadaver was sitting next to my mother, I said. Oh. They were strangers to each other when they got on that bus, but by the time they got off 6 days later, they were friends. My mother told Mrs. Cadaver all about me and my father and our farm in Bybanks. She told Mrs. Cadaver about the fields and the blackberries and Moody Blue and the chickens and the singing tree. I think that if she told Mrs. Cadaver all that, then my mother must have been missing us, don't you think? I'm sure of it, the sheriff said. And how do you know all this? So I explained to him how Mrs. Cadaver had told me all this on the day Phoebe's mother returned. Mrs. Cadaver told me about how my father visited her in the hospital in Lewiston after he had buried my mother. He came to see the only survivor from the bus crash. And when he learned about Mrs. Cadaver had been sitting next to my mother, they started talking about her. They talked for 6 hours. Mrs. Cadaver told me about her and my father writing to each other, and about how my father needed to get away from Bybanks for a while. I asked Mrs. Cadaver why my father hadn't told me how he had met her, and she said he tried to, but I didn't want to hear it, and he didn't want to upset me. He thought I might dislike Margaret because she had survived and my mother had not. Do you love him? I had asked Mrs. Cadaver. Are you going to marry him? Goodness, she said. It's a little early for that. He's holding on to me because I was with your mother and held her hand in her last moments. Your father isn't ready to love anyone else yet. Your mother was one of a kind. That's true. She was. And even though Mrs. Cadaver had told me all this and had told me how she had been with my mother in her last minutes, I still did not believe that my mother was actually dead. I still thought that there might have been a mistake. I don't know what I had hoped to find in Lewiston. Maybe I expected that I would see her walking through a field and I would call to her and she would say, "Oh, Salmanica, my left arm," and "Oh, Salmanica, take me home." I slept for the last 50 miles into Coeur d'Alene, and when I awoke, I was sitting in the sheriff's car outside the hospital entrance. The sheriff was coming out of the hospital. He handed me an envelope and slid in beside me on the seat. In the envelope was a note from Gramps giving the name of the motel he was staying at. Beneath that, he had written, "I am sorry to say that our gooseberry died at 3 o'clock this morning." Gramps was sitting on the side of the bed in the motel, talking on the telephone. When he saw me and the sheriff at the door, he put the phone down and hugged me to him. The sheriff told Gramps how sorry he was and that he didn't think it was the time or place to give anybody a lecture about underage granddaughters driving down a mountainside in the middle of the night. He handed Gramps his car key and asked Gramps if he needed help making any arrangements. Gramps said he had taken care of most things. Gramps' body was being flown back to Bybanks, where my father would meet the plane. Gramps and I were going to finish what we had to be done in Coeur d'Alene and leave the next morning. After the sheriff and his deputy left, I noticed Gramps and Gramps' open suitcase. Inside were Gramps' things, all mixed in with Gramps' clothes. I picked up her baby powder and smelled it. On the desk was a crumpled letter. When Gramps saw me look at it, he said, "I wrote her a letter last night. It's a love letter." Gramps lay down on the bed and stared up at the ceiling. "Chickabiddy," he said, "I miss my gooseberry." He put one arm over his eyes. His other hand patted the empty space beside him. "This ain't," he said. "This ain't." "It's okay," I said. I sat down on the other side of the bed and held his hand. "This ain't your marriage bed." About 5 minutes later, Gramps cleared his throat and said, but it will have to do. Chapter 44, Bybanks. We're back in Bybanks now. My father and I are living on our farm again, and Gramps is living with us. Gram is buried in the aspen grove where she and Gramps were married. We miss our gooseberry every single day. Lately, I've been wondering if there might be something hidden behind the fireplace, because just as the fireplace was behind the plaster wall, and my mother's story was behind Phoebe's, I think there was a third story behind Phoebe's and my mother's, and that was about Gram and Gramps. On the day after Gram was buried, her friend Gloria, the one Gram thought was so much like Phoebe, and the one who had a hankering for Gramps, came to visit Gramps. They sat on our porch while Gramps talked about Gram for 4 hours straight. Gloria asked if he had any aspirin. She had a grand headache. We haven't seen her since. I wrote to Tom Fleet, the boy who had helped Gram when the snake took a snack out of her leg. I told him that Gram made it back to Bybanks, but unfortunately she came in a coffin. I described the aspen grove where she was buried and told him about the river nearby. He wrote back saying that he was sorry about Gram and maybe he would come and visit the aspen grove someday. Then he asked, "Is your riverbank private property?" Gramps is giving me more driving lessons in the pickup truck. We practice over on Gramps' old farm, where the new owner lets us clonk around on the dirt roads. With us rides Gramps' new beagle puppy, which he named Huzzah, Huzzah. Gramps pets the puppy and smokes his pipe as I drive, and we both play the moccasin game. It's a game we made up on our way back from Idaho. We take turns pretending we are walking in someone else's moccasins. If I were walking in Peebee's moccasins, I would be jealous of a new brother dropping out of the sky. If I were in Gram's moccasins right this minute, I would want to cool my feet in that river over there. If I were walking in Ben's moccasins, I would miss Salmanica Hiddle. On and on we go. We walk in everybody's moccasins, and we have discovered some interesting things that way. One day I realized that our whole trip out to Lewiston had been a gift from Gram and Gramps to me. They were giving me the chance to walk in my mother's moccasins, to see what she had seen and feel what she might have felt on her last trip. I also realized that there were lots of reasons why my father didn't take me to Idaho when he got the news of her death. He was too grief-stricken, and he was trying to spare me. Only later did he understand that I had to go and see for myself. He was right about one thing, though. We didn't need to bring her body back because she is in the trees, the barn, the fields. Gramps is different. He needs Gram right here. He needs to walk out to that aspen grove to see his gooseberry. One afternoon after we had been talking about Prometheus stealing fire from the sun to give to man, and about Pandora opening up the forbidden box with all the evils of the world in it, Gram said that those myths evolved because people needed a way to explain where fire came from and why there was evil in the world. That made me think of Phoebe and the lunatic, and I said, if I were walking in Phoebe's moccasins, I would have to believe in a lunatic and an axe-wielding Miss Cadaver to explain my mother's disappearance. Phoebe and her family helped me, I think. They helped me to think about and understand my own mother. Phoebe's tales were like my fishing in the air. For a while I needed to believe that my mother was not dead and that she would come back. I still fish in the air sometimes. It seems to me that we can't explain all the truly awful things in the world like war and murder and brain tumors, and we can't fix those things. So we look at the frightening things that are closer to us, and we magnify them until they burst open. Inside is something that we can manage, something that isn't as awful as it had at first seemed. It is a relief to discover that although there might be axe murderers and kidnappers in the world, most people seem a lot like us, sometimes afraid and sometimes brave, sometimes cruel and sometimes kind. I decided that bravery is looking Pandora's box full in the eye as best as you can, and then turning to the other box, the one with the smooth, beautiful folds inside. Mama kissing trees, my Gram saying, "Huzzah, huzzah," Gramps in his marriage bed, my mother's postcards and her hair all still beneath the floorboards in my room. I reread all the postcards when I came home. Gram and Gramps and I had been to every place my mother had. There are the Black Hills, Mount Rushmore, the Badlands. The only card that is still hard for me to read is the one from Coeur d'Alene, the one that I received 2 days after she died. When I drive Gramps around in his truck, I also tell him all the stories my mother had told me. His favorite is a Navajo one about Istinali. She's a woman who never dies. She grows from a baby to mother to old woman and then turns into a baby again, and on she goes, living 1,000 lives. Gramps likes this, and so do I. I still climb the sugar maple tree, and I've heard the singing tree sing. The sugar maple tree is my thinking place. Yesterday in the sugar maple I realized that I was jealous of 3 things. The first jealousy is a foolish one. I am jealous of whoever Ben wrote about in his journal, because it was not me. The second jealousy is this. I am jealous that my mother had wanted more children. Wasn't I enough? When I walk in her moccasins, though, I say, if I were my mother, I might want more children, not because I don't love my Salmanica, but because I love her so much, I want more of these. Maybe that is a fish in the air, and maybe it isn't, but it is what I want to believe. The last jealousy is not foolish, nor is it one that will go away just yet. I am jealous that Phoebe's mother came back and mine did not. I miss my mother. Ben and Phoebe write to me all the time. Ben sent me a valentine in the middle of October that said, "Roses are red, dirt is brown, please be my valentine, or else I'll frown." There was a P.S. added. I've never written poetry before. I sent a valentine back that said, "Dry as the desert, wet as the rain, your love for me is not in vain." I added a P.S. that said, "I've never written any poetry either. Ben and Phoebe and Mrs. Cadaver and Mrs. Partridge are all coming to visit next month. There is a chance that Mr. Berkway might come as well, but Phoebe hopes not, as she does not think she could stand to be in a car for that long with a teacher. My father and I have been scrubbing the house for their visit. I can't wait to show Phoebe and Ben the swimming hole in the fields, the hayloft and the trees, and the cows and the chickens. Blackberry, the chicken that Ben gave me, is the queen of the coop, and I'll show Ben her too. I am hoping also for some blackberry kisses. But for now, Gramps has his beagle, and I have a chicken and a singing tree, and that's the way it is. Huzzah! Huzzah!